Hello, I'm Dr. Russell Warne. I'm an assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Behavioral Science at Utah Valley University. I've created this video to explain the concept of psychometric test bias to viewers. The basis of this video is an article I published in 2014 with my colleague Myung-Sun Yoon of Texas A&M University and my student Chris J. Price. Test bias is a topic that is frequently debated in American society, especially for academic and cognitive tests like the SAT or intelligence tests. Some people claim that these tests are culturally biased against examinees from non-dominant cultural groups, especially African Americans and Hispanics. This is because these groups often score lower on the test than white or Asian American examinees. The existence of these differences in mean scores is not controversial, and often people describe this in terms of an achievement gap between demographic groups when they're discussing educational tests. What's controversial is the cause of these score differences. This video only discusses one proposed cause: problems with the test that give an unfair advantage to white examinees. In my field, we call this unfair advantage test bias. There are 5 ways that people define test bias. These are observed differences in mean scores across demographic groups, differences in the ability for a test to predict future outcomes for examinees, items functioning differently for examinees who belong to different demographic groups, differences in the inter-item correlations or in the way that items group themselves together. In testing parlance, we call these item groups factors. And consequences in test use that create or perpetuate social inequalities among groups. In this video, I will explain each of these 5 definitions and discuss the thinking among leading psychologists about each of these definitions. I will also discuss empirical evidence related to each definition. Definition number 1. Observed differences among demographic groups in mean scores. People who subscribe to this definition believe that the mere existence of differences in scores across groups is evidence that a test is biased and that it gives an unfair advantage to some examinees. This is the most common definition of test bias among people who do not have any professional training in psychometrics or testing issues. Ironically, it is also the most strongly rejected definition among experts. Some people are puzzled when I tell them that even pervasive differences among racial or cultural groups is not by itself evidence of test bias. The reason that experts do not believe this is that sometimes tests measure real differences that exist among groups. In the article, my co-authors and I give the example of a test of job satisfaction given to 2 groups: medical interns and tenured college professors. Medical interns frequently have long hours, little control over their schedule, stressful working conditions, and low pay given their level of education. Tenured college professors, however, often have flexible work schedules, low stress, and high job security. A test of job satisfaction should produce results showing that on average, college professors score higher in job satisfaction than medical interns. If the test didn't produce these results, it could be evidence that the test is not functioning properly. The moral of the story is that group differences in scores are not, by themselves, evidence of test bias. Granted, this example is different because the groups are occupational groups and the test is not a cognitive test. However, theoretically, those issues are irrelevant, and the general principle still applies. Definition number 2. Differences in the ability for a test to predict outcomes for examinees from different groups. Many standardized tests are created to help professionals make predictions about future outcomes for the examinees. The classic example of this is the SAT, which was designed to help college admissions personnel make predictions of applicants' freshman college GPA. The strength of the correlation between SAT scores and freshman college GPA varies from university to university, but a typical correlation is about 0.4. According to this definition of test bias, a test is biased if the test's ability to predict outcomes varies from group to group. The best way to examine for this type of test bias is to find separate correlations between the test score and the outcome for the different demographic groups. If there is no test bias and no group differences, then the scatter plot and the prediction lines should look like this. Each examinee is represented by a dot. Orange dots represent one demographic group, while blue dots represent another. The dots are all intermingled, and the two groups have the same average test score. Also, the same regression line represents both groups' data points well. Sometimes, though, two groups have different means. You can see what this looks like here in this graph. Members of the blue group now obtain higher scores on average than members of the orange group. However, the same regression line represents both groups well, which means that the test predicts the same outcomes for examinees, regardless of their group membership. So there would be no test bias in this example, even though one group scores higher than the other on average. Another common scenario can be seen in this figure. Here we see that one group scores higher than another, but now the same regression line does not fit both groups. Instead, we have two parallel lines, with the lower scoring group having a lower regression line. If a researcher combines their data, however, they would produce the regression line shown in black, which actually doesn't represent either group's data very well. This is what happens, for example, with white and African American students on the SAT. On average, white students score higher on the SAT, and if a researcher separates white and African American students' data and makes separate predictions, then parallel regression lines are often observed. Because the common regression line doesn't represent either group well, making separate predictions based on each demographic group seems fair. But actually, it can hurt members of disadvantaged groups. This can be shown by providing a hypothetical example of the predictions that would be made for two different examinees who achieve the same score on a test. The first one belongs to the orange group, and with the score here, they would be predicted to have an outcome that is somewhat low if only data from their demographic group is used to make statistical predictions. But a person from the blue group who obtains the same test score would be predicted to have much better outcomes if predictions for them are based solely on their group's data. This unfair advantage is an example of test bias. But if we make a prediction for both individuals on the basis of the entire data set, then we predict that both will have the same outcome, which is here in black. It's obvious in this diagram that by mingling together both groups' data, we actually give an advantage to members of the lower group because we now predict better outcomes than we would if we only examined their data individually. On the other hand, the higher group has a disadvantage that we use when we use both groups' data. Now let's say that the test score on this diagram is an SAT score, and the outcome is freshman college GPA. If I'm part of a university's admissions committee, then I might only want to admit students who would likely earn a certain GPA in college. If we use the group's data separately to set SAT score cutoffs, then the SAT score cutoff for admission will actually be higher for the disadvantaged group and lower for the advantaged group. However, if we use the same standard for both groups on the basis of their combined data, then a larger proportion of disadvantaged students would be admitted to college because the admissions cutoff score is lower when it's based on the combined data. It means that usually this type of test bias is not a major concern for testing experts because it actually helps disadvantaged groups if we use a common regression line for everybody. Testing experts have been aware of this odd paradox since the 1960s. Another possible situation is shown in this figure, which shows that intercepts of the regression lines for the two groups are equal, but their slopes are different. This situation is more problematic than the last scenario, especially when the regression lines cross. However, even this is not proof of test bias because this may occur because of problems in the way the outcome is measured. For example, in a college setting, the regression lines for the two groups may be non-parallel if there is a campus environment that is more hostile to the disadvantaged group, or if one group has greater difficulty succeeding in college due to financial problems, language or cultural barriers, or other difficulties. Non-parallel regression lines may also occur if the skills the test measures and the skills needed to perform well on the outcome are not the same. Definition number 3, differences in how items function across groups. Because of the problems with the first two definitions, interest turned to other ways of defining test bias. Many researchers started in the 1970s to examine specific test items because they were the building blocks of a test. Under definition number 3, experts try to assess whether specific test items function differently for different demographic groups. If the items don't function the same way, then test scores from those groups are not directly comparable and no test bias is present. Test bias is present. This is called differential item functioning, or diff. There are several analyses for diff, and they're too complex to describe here. Simply put, the examinees from different demographic groups are usually matched to have equal levels of whatever characteristic is being measured, such as academic achievement. Then the researcher tries to determine whether matched members of different demographic groups answer the item in inconsistent ways. In an academic test, this may mean that one group finds the test item harder than the other does, even though they have been matched to have equal levels of academic achievement. For example, on a middle school science achievement test, the researcher may match examinees on their total test score, and then examine males and females with the same total score and determine whether each individual item is systematically harder for one group or another. If an item is harder for one group than another, then it is said to have differential item functioning. This is a simplified explanation of diff, and people watching this video should be aware that there are several ways to measure diff. Plus, many DIF methods have some flaws. However, it is a very commonly used procedure, and any professionally developed academic or cognitive test in the 21st century has had every item screened for diff before being released to the public. Test creators who find diff in their tests have a few options. Items with severe diff are usually eliminated from a test completely. When modest diff is present, test developers often try to balance items with diff so that they cancel each other out. For an example, an item that favors males may be balanced out with an item that favors females. Even when this balance is not perfect, any benefit one group has over another is usually so small that the overall scores are impacted very minimally. When DIF methods were invented, researchers started searching for item characteristics that lead to DIF on educational and cognitive tests. There are some general rules of thumb. On reading items, males perform better when a reading passage is about a stereotypical male interest, like football, power tools, or the military. Women tend to be favored on items about stereotypically female interests, such as arts and human relationships. DIF characteristics for racial or ethnic groups are usually much more difficult to make generalizations about. African Americans tend to do better on mathematics items that require solely computation. White students tend to perform better on story problems. Racial minorities in the United States also tend to perform better on verbal items related to topics like the civil rights movement and culturally relevant practices and observances, like a quinceañera. Non-native English speakers tend to perform better on vocabulary items that contain words that have cognates in their native language. Keep in mind that these are broad generalizations that may not apply to every test item. In fact, there are so many exceptions to these statements that a skilled item writer could create some test items that contain this sort of content without DIF. Definition number 4, differing factor structures across groups. One statistical method that experts use to understand their tests is called factor analysis. This statistical procedure groups test items together according to how well they correlate with one another. These groups are called factors and consist of items that relate to each other much more strongly than they relate to other items on the test. In the testing world, we diagram factor analysis like this, where each test item is a rectangle and each factor is an oval. Researchers draw arrows connecting items to the factor that they belong to. In this diagram, there are two factors. The first one consists of 3 items, and the second factor consists of 4 items. The double-headed arrow between the two factors shows that these two factors are correlated with each other. Like DIF, factor analysis is a complex statistical procedure, but this explanation is good enough for this purpose. Ideally, a factor analysis performed on data from one demographic group should have the same results as a factor analysis performed on data from a different demographic group. If this is the case, then scores from these two groups can be compared and no test bias is present. On the other hand, let's say that this diagram represents the factor analysis results from males, and this diagram represents the factor analysis on data from females. In this case, the results from the test are not comparable across groups because the test items are not grouping together the same way. That means that there is no one scoring system that could apply to both groups without distorting someone's scores. Differing factor analysis results may indicate, for example, that the two groups are interpreting the test items differently, or they are using different strategies to respond to test items. There are other possible reasons for this too. Comparing factor structures is a relatively new procedure, developed in the 1990s, and it's often unclear what to do with a test that produces different factor structures across groups. The issue becomes more complex under some circumstances, such as when portions of the test function the same way across groups, but other portions do not. Another complex situation that is possible is that the same sample of examinees may not show test bias across one type of group, such as gender groups, but dividing the sample into other groups, such as racial groups, may result in different factor structures. It is often unclear why differing factor structures occur. Definition number 5, consequences of test use across groups. On many tests, there are score gaps across demographic groups. Applying the same standard for admission to an educational program or a job interview may be viewed by some as discriminatory because of these score differences. It may also frustrate efforts to reduce social inequalities. Therefore, some people believe that a test is biased if it disadvantages one demographic group over another, even if that is not the test user's or the test creator's intent. This is essentially an argument over whether using a test is unfair, and that the consequences are biased, in the everyday sense of the word. This is a moral or ethical argument, whereas the other 4 definitions of test bias have all been statistical. The problem with conflating a moral definition with statistical definitions is that ethical arguments cannot be solved with science. People with the same data but with different ethical goals may reach vastly different conclusions about what is fair or reasonable or the right thing to do. A classic example in American education should make this obvious. Since its inception, the SAT has produced higher scores for white examinees than African American examinees on average. This was not the creator's intention. This finding is not unique to the SAT, but it's a good example because the SAT is the most scrutinized test on the planet, and it is free of test bias in the statistical sense. Because of the score gap between racial groups, applying the same admission standard to college applicants will result in a disproportionately large number of African American students being denied admission, while white students would be admitted in disproportionately larger numbers. One observer could claim that this is unfair and that it is in society's best interest to admit African American and white students at rates in proportion to their numbers in the population at large. The result would be a more equal society, reduced poverty for underprivileged groups, and a richer, more stimulating campus environment for all students. This is essentially the argument for affirmative action in the United States, and it has a large body of legal reasoning supporting it. However, another equally rational observer may say that it is fair to apply the same standard to every college applicant regardless of their race. These people see the benefits of a pure meritocracy and think that a university would benefit from having to offer fewer remedial courses, and that resentment would be reduced in the student body because every student would know that they were admitted on their merits. Just like pro-affirmative action perspectives, this viewpoint has a great deal of legal reasoning in support of it. Science cannot settle this argument because it is a moral argument, and science is not equipped to answer moral or ethical questions. Rather, it is best settled through public mechanisms such as the courts, the ballot box, and legislative initiatives. Therefore, what do my co-authors and I do about this definition of test bias? We recommend that people distinguish between bias in the statistical sense and unfairness in the moral or ethical sense. This should reduce confusion. We also believe that people should only talk about test bias when using the statistical sense of the phrase. To recap, there are 5 definitions of test bias. Observe differences among demographic groups and mean scores. Differences in the ability for a test to predict future outcomes for examinees. Items functioning in different ways for examinees who belong to different demographic groups. Differences in the inter-item correlations, or in the way that items group themselves together. And consequences in test use that create or perpetuate social inequalities across groups. The first definition has been universally rejected by testing experts, and the second through fourth definitions, although not perfect, have received wider acceptance. The last definition is controversial, but as long as people distinguish between scientific and ethical issues, it is acceptable to many. I want to close with 2 more points. First, some people believe that they can judge that a test item is biased merely by analyzing its content. One famous example is from the SAT. Runner is to marathon as A. Envoy is to embassy, B. Martyr is to massacre, C. Oarsman is to regatta, D. Referee is to tournament, or E. Horse is to stable. The answer is C, because a marathon and a regatta are both competitions, and a runner is a participant in a marathon, and an oarsman is a participant in a regatta. In the late 1970s, when this SAT question came to light, many people criticized it. They believed that knowledge about terminology related to regattas was confined mostly to white, upper-class students. This has become such a famous item that I still find it mentioned in media articles and online as an example of how the SAT is supposedly biased against low-income or diverse teenagers, even though the item hasn't been on the test since Jimmy Carter was president. In fact, the SAT hasn't had any analogy items on it since 2005. Apart from the obsolete nature of the item, there is the simple fact that it is impossible to know how a test item will function just by examining item content. A frustrating aspect of test design is that sometimes items don't always measure what they appear to measure. The literature on psychological and educational test creation is full of examples of items that surprise their creators because they don't function as designed. Given this fact, I don't know how a layman could confidently explain what an item measures and whether that item functions the same way across demographic groups. These are things that have to be examined with statistical data. Additionally, the tone of these criticisms is patronizing. To say, for example, that a teenager in the inner city couldn't possibly know what the word regatta means, to me is racist and classist. These critics contend that they know what a person from a different culture or social class is capable of learning, and that it is inherently less than a white, upper-class child's environment. Moreover, these claims are based entirely on anecdote and supposition about examinees' knowledge and experience. Until critics of standardized testing are willing to gather the data that testing experts have, it is difficult to take their arguments seriously. I also want to mention another aspect of educational and psychological testing, and that's that tests can measure social inequality and progress. An example of this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, which is the only educational standardized test that can be used to compare scores across state lines. Other tests can be used to compare individuals across state lines, but not groups. Here's an image of the African American white score gap in reading scores at age 9 from 1971 to 2008 on NAEP. The graph shows that the score gap has been reduced by 20 points in that time period. This is information about social progress that the United States has made in closing the achievement gap that would not be available without a standardized test like NAEP. Finally, I want viewers to remember that standardized tests aren't perfect. Yet they're the best available option for measuring people's psychological traits or educational achievements. Any alternative to standardized testing that has been proposed in the past 90 years has either been more expensive, more time-consuming, or more subjective than standardized tests. If someone were to create a better method of assessing a large number of people quickly, they would become a millionaire overnight. For nearly a century, people have tried and failed. Even with the method's flaws, administering a standardized test is the best known way to assess human beings. I hope you learned something about test bias and testing in psychology and education from this video. Check out the article that this video is based on by clicking the link below or looking up the reference here on the screen at your university library.